diving here. Let me dive in immediately. So it's about regional culture, and that's obviously a bit sensitive topic, as you can imagine. But that's okay if I tell you a bit about my background. I'm originally from Bosnia, so that's where I'm born, and I was about 80 years old, 70 years old to be precise. Ended up in Netherlands, lived there for 20 years, and now living in Hong Kong for 12 years, 13 years almost actually. And so I worked with across Asia and many actually countries, also in Europe, and seen quite a few cultures. And, so you can imagine in the journey, made quite a few mistakes when it comes to cultures, assumptions about it. And obvious one, and is and still maybe making today also a bit, is talking openly about sensitive topics, as if it is not sensitive at all. That's typical Dutch thing. Even more Bosnian thing. It's just in Bosnia it kind of went completely wrong, as you probably know. So if you go too far with it. Yeah. The difference between, immediately cultural difference, between Bosnian and Dutch is that Dutch know where to stop when they debate and argue. Yeah. So why this topic? Why is it important? It's probably obvious, I guess, especially in Singapore, because Singapore is a very international community. And so we are continuously more globalized, whether we want it or not. So mixing between different nations is happening more and more, and businesses are growing and engaging with other countries more and more. In Singapore this is obvious, but in some other regions, not that much. And so part of resilience of a company and part of how to organize things is also about adapting to and learning from different cultures. Now, adaptive to, I'm going to dive in quite a bit, okay? And the second part, learning from, is also a bit of an invitation to yourself for today, for the rest of the evening, if you stay around, or tomorrow, to maybe find a chance to talk to each other about it more openly, okay? And so I suspect that one of the reasons we are not talking more about it is because it tends to be sensitive. It tends to be, we want to avoid be offensive about it, etc. Okay, but I'm going to show you why it is actually really important. Today, for the rest of the evening, if you stay around, or tomorrow, to maybe find a chance to talk to each other about it more openly. Okay, and so I suspect that one of the reasons we are not talking more about it is because it tends to be sensitive. It tends to be, we want to avoid be offensive about it, etc. Okay, but I'm going to show you why it is actually really important. I was in a company a few years ago, a number of years ago actually, not a few, and was asked as a coach to help with a team. And the manager was a French guy, and he said, I'm struggling with this team, Victor, and yeah, agile coach and stuff, should I step in? So what's going on? So yeah, they just don't work together well. I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but they seem to really hate each other. And it's clearly showing off in the performance of the team. So bottom line, he says, no matter what, at the end, this team has to improve. Okay, that's the bottom line. There's no debatable. Which is agile or not, or self-management or not, should not be broken. Okay, whether it's self-managed or not, team has to become better. That's the bottom line. So I said, I agree. Okay, but let's not step in and start to do funny stuff. Let's see actually what's happening. So I went in, started talking to people, and I asked, what's going on? And nobody says much. Now, to give you a bit of perspective, most of the team members are from India in this team, and there were one guy from Hong Kong. And so if you ask in a group what's going on, nothing comes out. Fine, everything fine, okay? So, and then one thing I learned in the meantime already is that you do not ask these questions in the group, so nothing comes out. So you went to first to a group of Indians during the nice lunch, and they always have a brilliant food. And so I always want to kind of join them because it smells so damn good. And so I joined them and I started to chit-chat. It took me a while, but at some point they start to open up. Okay, they start to say, yeah, this guy just everything that goes well, he taps himself on the shoulder that he did it, and when something goes wrong, he blames us. We really, really don't trust him. Now, I went to other guy. The other guy has his own story. Yeah, they are always doing the same thing. Nobody wants to improve anything, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So both it took a while to actually get to them to expose this. And then I asked, like, did you talk to each other? And the answer is, as always, we tried. So when somebody said we tried, no, they didn't. So I suggested, shall we try for real? And so I can help you. And so I can, let's sit together and at the end of the work and we talk about this stuff. And I mean, yeah, we have to do something, right? Because at the end, the team has to resolve this. Okay. Basically a question which you can't really say no, regardless of the culture. And so that's something I would consciously use as a trick. It's not always okay, but it's unconsciously that happens. So phrasing the question in such a way that people can't really say no. And so that's also, you could say, manipulative. Don't try in Netherlands, they're just gonna say no. So I put them in a room and I start to say, okay, talk. Now, nothing happens first. Oh, come on, guys, we need to solve this problem. And the guys from India start to talk. And they beat around the bush, okay? So giving direct feedback in India is not a thing. Okay, so you start to talk a lot, but not really say it. And so typical me Dutch, they start to say, come on, get to the point, bloody hell. So I'm getting really nervous, and so it's against my nature. And so it wasn't even more. And so then pushing harder, and at some point they start to talk, and then became, they start to be very offensive, like you, blah, blah, blah. Oh. When I say start to talk, and I mean to be offensive, let's talk about how to give a feedback. You keep it to yourself. You say, the way I feel about the situation, blah, 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 but don't start to say you are, especially you are, and you're kind of labeling people. That's just offensive. That's not appropriate regardless of culture. Okay, so we start to do that, and also go to a guy from Hong Kong and ask, like, okay, what's your view? How do people in Hong Kong react to that situation? Okay, there's a few things I learned in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has its own culture. In order to avoid conflicts, you just don't talk. But why? Why you don't talk? Well, basically, if I start talking, I only have a lose-lose proposition. I can either embarrass myself or embarrass the person that's in front of me. Either way, it's just a lose proposition. So why should I talk? There's just no gain here. Okay? This is what I've been told over and over again. Okay? So I clearly noticed that's not the case in Singapore. That's my perception. Yes. So people do talk. And so what happens, I pushed, and then he at some point started to talk. And then they talked a bit. Did it got resolved? No, really. They talked at least. So I thought maybe we made some progress. So I said at the end, well, maybe we should have another meeting. And then what happened? They had another meeting, and nothing really happened, not much. And then the guy from Hong Kong left the team. And he ended up in a new organization where he felt much better in his position. And it was also international. It just didn't fit in that team properly. Problem solved. Okay. Now, I've been telling this story in my trainings quite often to talk about self-management. That you can perfectly have a self-management, and this is how one of the high level of self-management, which means you don't have to fire people. You just need to ensure there's an environment within which people basically resolve the problems. But what I always forgot to tell, that this situation is really, really exceptional and very unnatural in this part of the world. So basically, I, as a Dutch or a Bosnian, basically force people into this situation. Okay? So I didn't realize there's a big cultural mismatch. They clearly didn't feel comfortable at all. Okay? So in retrospect, it wasn't a very good idea that I've done this. it kind of worked, but it's not a good way to achieve it. Anybody read this book? One person, two, yeah. So anybody saw the TikTok of this? Just kidding. So culture map. So my goal after this talk is that you're all gonna be reading this book. Let's see if I'm gonna achieve it. So,
yes.
What she describes, this resonates?
Yes.
Oh, really? Okay. This is actually, when I was reading it, this was relatively new for me. It just resonated so much. It was such an important thing. And so, who's first to see this graph? Yeah, I guess quite a few. Let me explain. So, in the countries on the left side, there's something low context starting point when you have a conversation. So when I start to explain something or converse with somebody else, then I assume, and then I kind of intuitively, I don't even think about it, it's just very natural, I assume that you don't understand the context within which what I'm going to explain you understand. So therefore, I give a full explanation, that's my natural tendency, I give a full context and explanation before I get to the point, okay? Before I actually start to make a point that I want to make. Or whatever the point that I'm making, I start to explain it quite extensively. In the countries in a high context, there is basically in environment, and Japan is the most extreme when it comes to that, there is a huge history where the people know from each other a lot. So if you say one word, they already understand what you mean by that. Okay? So basically, it doesn't require much information in order to convey the message. Okay? This has to do with history. And so some other countries are kind of in between. So this is a really important thing for me that created lots of trouble for me, as you can imagine, because I'm almost entirely on the left in my way of behavior. Only Americans are more to the left. And while I'm working in a country such as Indonesia, yeah, and Hong Kong is the same here, same somewhere here. China is basically on this side, quite a lot. Okay. So, so this creates a strange conversations very often. Feels very awkward, very difficult to actually make conversation. So, oh, because of the camera.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So this creates a strange conversations, and it's quite important if you understand this low context, high context concept in order to have a better conversation. This means that from both parties, it's useful to know. What do you do instead? You start to accommodate, you adapt somewhat. Okay? Meaning that you try to explain a bit more than you would explain somebody from the same country. Now, US is actually heavily low context environment, but I think Singapore is here? Oh, here. Yeah, it's not as high context as some other countries. Why is US all the way to the left? Is because historically, people in US are coming from all over the planet. Okay, so the culture is like a mix of very different kinds of people. So whenever they engage with somebody else, they need to provide a full context in order for other person to understand what you're talking about. While somebody in Japan, you don't have to. Yeah. Okay. Another thing, yeah.
So what happens if the person from the left talks to the person on the right? You just are two those?
So what happens is that the opinions basically from somebody, from me, when I talk to somebody, let's say in Hong Kong, in Hong Kong they say few words, and then I try to make sense out of what they mean, and I'm feeling like, where's the rest of the sentence? Where's the grammar? Where's the context? What are they talking about? So you kind of constantly try to, you're strained. You try to guess what the heck is going on, and that's what happens in my mind. Other way around, when somebody from these countries talks to listen to me when I talk, they're thinking, Do you think that I'm an idiot? Because you explain it so much as if I don't have a clue what you're talking about. They're not used to that kind of a talking. Yeah. That's what happens. Yes.
Thanks for providing context, by the way.
Yeah. So, and then you have a direct negative feedback and indirect negative feedback. Okay, so in many countries, it's simply not okay to give indirect negative feedback. Oh, sorry, direct negative feedback. So what happens in, for example, Indonesia, is that you usually go to somebody else, and that somebody else is going to provide it to you, and that somebody else has to be a person who's close to me, and then I get the feedback. Direct, no. I try to give direct feedback to a person, especially directly, even without a group, just in person. There's a very uncomfortable situation immediately. Yeah. So, yeah, so you could say that. So this is a simple fact of a culture. What's interesting about this is that this one is very important to notice is that if you are uncomfortable with the feedback, direct feedback, negative feedback, then I need to be aware of the consequence of that. If you don't have some way to compensate, like what I just explained, that you still get it but for somebody else, what happens is that you start to get talking behind the back, and that's not good in any culture. Yeah. So that's something that I clearly notice So you have a more talking behind the back. Yeah. So because of the direct negative feedback here, there's lots of negative consequences of that, by the way, also. But there's one positive, is that when the people talk behind the back, which they also do, it's much more common that somebody says, "Why are you talking to me about that person? Why don't you go to him and tell directly?" That's a very normal remark. Now you can imagine, so low context, high context, and then indirect negative feedback and direct negative feedback, and then having extremes of those in combination. So what kind of trouble it creates? Okay. So that's I clearly notice when I'm communicating people who are closer to my area, let's say, that's just easier. Yeah. And so the one thing which I also want to give you, that we really need to stop judging the other ones just because essentially in the direct quadrants. So we have a tendency to make a judgment about people, such as, Chinese are always so quiet. They're not, okay? So that kind of statements I hear as a Westerner quite a lot from other Westerners. Now this is, you can create a map. Okay, and so it's an interesting map, and so you have a low context, high context. Feedback, we talked about it, and then this one is really interesting. How you persuade people. Okay, so in the West there is a distinction. It's basically a scale: principle first or application first. Now, what's application first? When Americans start to explain something, want to convince somebody of something, what they basically do is they use an example, basically say, look, it worked in this company, so it should work in your case. Look at Tesla, it's an amazing company, everybody should do what Tesla does. Look at blah, 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 Google, Microsoft, well, so just do whatever they do, okay? Now in Europe, this is typically frowned upon. Why? Because they are very principle first, meaning it doesn't make sense to copy-paste the practices from companies. You need to understand underlying theory before you get to application. Okay? Which one is good? No judgment here. There's a pros and cons of both. Okay? What's maybe interesting that you see that China doesn't have a ball here. They're not on a scale. Actually, it's not only China, it's Asia in general. So you might be asking, how do we actually persuade people in Asia? Interestingly enough, it's a very different orthogonal to this. It's not principle based, not application first. It's basically what it's called. What's the term? It's a systemic, essentially. So it's a looking basically at the whole situation as a whole, and then approaching the problem basically from many different perspectives, which are kind of related to the topic what you have at hand. Okay. So to give you an example, in Europe, it's perfectly normal to say, I don't know, is it better to have a manager for the people or the people self-manage? And then you can have a debate about it, and then the people say pros and cons about it. Okay? In America, they simply say, oh, look at the richest company, they still have managers, so managers is good. In Asia, what is usually being done is you don't really talk about which is good or better, but you look at all the aspects that influence, at the end, give some insight about which one is better or good or worse. This is a tendency. Okay, I'm not saying I'm maybe overgeneralizing a bit. Obviously, there's in Asia people who don't do that, but if you compare as a whole. Yeah. So you look at things holistically, that's the word I want to say. Okay, so you approach things from any perspective to kind of analyze the situation. Okay, and so for European, this feels like what the heck are we talking about? The question is, do you feel that it's good to have a manager or not have a manager? That's the question. Give me the answer. And you talk about, yeah, but what about the people? What about this? What about that? What about this? So we kind of approach it like that. Okay. Hierarchical. Egalitarian. So I'm not going to go through of them, but what's sticking out here is a Japanese, I don't know if you knew that, is highly consensual decision making, which is quite different from the rest of Asia. Most of the Asian countries are top-down decision making. Okay. And then obviously relationship-based and avoiding confrontation and scheduling, I guess you can imagine. It's quite an important one, by the way. So how we look at the time. Now we can continue like that. There's like a lot more countries. How does this relate to less? Well, the company culture is important, okay? And in less we recognize that very much. But one of the major statements that we make is the culture follows structure. So lots of what we notice in a company is related to how a company is structured. You see, if you create a lots of layers, people behave accordingly, etc. But we're talking about the company culture in this case. What about regional culture? Okay, can you just change the structure and also regional culture then gets changed? No. So it has a limitation to it. Up to a certain level you can influence, but not that much. So what I notice a lot is that regional culture is dominant one in a company if the majority of the group are from that culture. So mainly, especially the management is from a specific culture, the group behaves accordingly. So even if you have a minority which is from a different culture, they will adapt. So they change their behavior. Okay, that's just natural when you go to company. The first thing what you do is you open your eyes and look at how everything works. What you're doing actually you're adapting to the culture. Now, getting to the failed less adoptions that I had, the mistakes that I made. The first one is a failed less adoption because of ignored top-down decision making. That's the obvious one. So I engage with a company in a certain region. And this especially happened in Hong Kong. And I'm thinking that they obviously want to listen to the voices of everybody and to have this consensual discussion whether to do less or not, etc. But actually it's only the management. And so therefore I don't engage management enough. And later on I found out they never really agreed. Okay, so we did a less adoption, but the management wasn't really for it. They were not fully engaged. People wanted it, but it doesn't matter actually. The second one is because of ignored consensual decision making. For example, I didn't know that in Vietnam, it's actually also consensual decision making. People are much more involved in all kinds of discussions. I assumed it's a very top-down. So I engaged with the management, but didn't engage enough with the teams. And the adoption failed simply because people said at some point, no, we're not buying into this. Completely surprised by that, simply because, how is it possible? I ask and everything, but the way they actually get involved in discussion is something I just didn't know. Okay, so ignorant essentially. So another failed SLS adoption is assuming that flat organization means also egalitarian leading style. Okay, I confuse quite often that if you have a flat organization, it means that the way it's being led is also, and decision making is being done, is basically by involving lots of people, consensual. No. You can have a perfectly flat, completely top-down management decision making. Every single decision, even a color on a screen of an app, needs to go through the top. Okay. And then also in some cases simply because the less principles mismatch the regional culture. Okay. Now you notice Singapore here, right? What's interesting is that so for me, I mostly worked with the companies in China, Hong Kong, and which are actually almost entirely here, and Netherlands is entirely here. Okay. So that makes it quite challenging. So how it prevents self-management, and this is, I guess, the key, one of the key things, is when all significant decisions are made by management regardless of the knowledge. Now, in certain cultures, like in Hong Kong and Singapore also, I believe, is a top-down decision making. So the management decides. Okay. Now, is that a problem? Actually, less. No, really. What we need to talk about, what kind of decisions? I mean, Les clearly says you want prioritization to be done by the top, not by everybody. Okay? It's a massively pushed centralized prioritization, which means the management decides what the important is. So please do that even better than you normally do. Okay? But the certain other types of decisions should be done by the teams. Now, even if you have a culture which says basically it's a top-down decision making could be also, we as a management now decide that you need to decide all kinds of stuff, but up to this level, okay? And the rest we decide. Make it explicit, and it works perfectly fine, okay? The trouble is it's often not explicit, so people need to guess. That's often a problem. And also that, that assumption is that all decision needs to go to the top. So consequence, I don't know in Singapore, but at least in Hong Kong, is that the management is extremely busy, as you can imagine, very pressured, stressed, because they need to make all these decisions. And so that becomes a bit of a problem. Okay, when consensual decision making leads to lack of focus, vision, and direction, extremely low adaptiveness. Not to mention so-called do whatever you want component teams. This is typically in the West, in Netherlands specifically, a big problem. The reason why we have in Netherlands so many component teams, my claim, and all these kind of messy structures and companies are not really performing, is because it's management not making decisions they should be making. Okay, but they leave it kind of like but we need to discuss everything. No, you don't. Yeah. Okay. So another one, when employees focus on their father, that's specifically in Chinese regions. Employees have a tendency to look at the management as their father or mother sometimes. And the father's supposed to take care of us as if we are children. This creates, up to a certain level, this is very commendable and very nice, but you can imagine how this can also create a problem. We had that situation in Indonesia also, and Jaguar explicitly said goodbye to that. The principal engineer was called Papa or something? Or? Yeah? Yeah, and the product owner was called Mama, right? If I remember. Yeah. And so, and they cannot take care of the team, etc. This led to not a good situation. It sounds good, but it's not good. So, and this one I already mentioned, talking behind the back. So, of course, you don't want to, in a certain culture, to avoid. You don't want to change from a direct negative into suddenly avoiding direct negative feedback and doing direct negative feedback. That's just not going to happen. Also, not something that you want. There's also negative things about it. But you need to really then be conscious about consequences of this talking behind the back. They tend to be toxic quite often. And they are lingering in organization, leading to all kinds of nasty stuff. Another one, if you avoidance of confrontation. So for example, you're sitting with a business, and the business is superior, and you are in a culture which says superior is right. You don't question, you don't confront, you don't say, you don't disagree. You can imagine how requirements gathering happens if you have a refinement. So you're supposed to ask why. Why do you want that? Why? I mean, I'm immediately confrontational, right? So there's a tendency to avoid that question, especially if why also tends to just lack of respect. You're going to lose your face. If I start to ask why, but you don't have a good reason, you're going to lose face. Yeah. So, so the requirements gathering suffers from that. Yeah. So I noticed this very, very often, that the team goes back. How do I discover, by the way, these things? I spend now a number of years in a team as an employee, as if I'm an employee, without any managerial position, explicitly arranged that. I was coding and together with the team, and I was basically just observing all this behavior. So what happens after the discussion about requirements? The team among themselves, together with me, start to then complain about how unclear everything is. And when I suggest, why don't you ask? Come on, sir. Okay. This one is really, really important one. When information discussion topics are kept at the management level, because they are for measurable, because they are for much more for that. Oh, they are because you don't want to kind of bother the team members, and so also they are. Why should I involve the team members? It's not their job, none of their concern. And so if you don't have involvement of the team in discussion information, that's how you prevent self-management. Because self-management is defined on the level of information that the team has. The less information you have, the less you can self-manage. It's simple as that. Or other way around, when you say you are a manager, the actual thing that defines you as a superior is the amount of information that you have, not your label. The fact, simply because you have more information, that's the power that you have. Okay, that's where the power comes from, nothing else. Yeah. That's why in the technical organizations, techie people are so damn powerful, because they simply have more information. And management can't really prevent that. Yeah. But less technical organization, that's not the case. Another one, if you have a remote, if you have a multi-culti team, and especially in the beginning you don't know each other well, and you're doing remotely, good luck. And that's asking for trouble. Serious trouble. So how to prevent that? Lots of experience with that. If you have to be remote, get people together at the very least for some time, get to know each other before you go remote again. Makes it easier. Okay. Second one, have courage to discuss these topics. I just touched quite a bit of them. I also made a judgmental things about them. We should normalize that somewhat. Okay. So make explicit agreements about which type of decisions are made by the teams collaboratively, which not. This is a very practical tip. So teach each other about your culture. So I mentioned it also in the beginning. So make it a conversation in your teams, in your organization. Tell each other about typical things that you notice about other culture. it's actually remarkably difficult to talk about your own culture. Why? Because we are blind for our own things. Keep in mind, the judgment about your own culture is difficult to make. Why? Because it's always in relationship to another culture. Okay? So if I talk to American as a Dutch, I feel that Americans are not direct at all. But if the American talk to somebody from the South America, the South Americans say, oh bloody hell, those Americans are so direct. Understand? Just to give you an example. It's always in relationship to somebody, some other culture. Another one, the beginning you mentioned also, do not try to imitate the other culture. Okay, so there's a quite interesting stories about that. If you try to imitate, you're always going to miss the mark. You simply don't have experience to understand the subtleties. For example, Dutch are very direct people, but for Dutch, this is just, you need to be very also careful, how do you say it? Okay, so which words to use, formulation, intonation, all this kind of a thing, context. There's so many factors which decide how you tell it. To foreigner, it looks just directness, but to Dutch, it looks very, very subtle. So if as a foreigner you try to be as direct, you're just gonna come across as like aggressive. That's how the Dutch gonna feel. Just to give an example. So instead, seek there's mutual understanding and compatibility. So you need to kind of dial down certain things and dial up certain other things. So also another thing is that sometimes we assume that the culture is a kind of like a fixed thing. You need to respect, that's how it is, that's it. I don't think so. And we are humans, we are highly adaptable, and the cultures change along the way. And especially if you think about your parents and compare culture of your parents and your own culture, you're probably going to notice some big differences. And so that's already says something. It's changing all the time. Now the big question is not necessarily to protect a certain culture. Well, culture should be protected in general, but also how, in which way you want that to adapt in this globalized world. Thank you.